Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. We're hanging out with you at 855-236-3228. That is 855-236-3228. Aaron in Illinois, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Aaron.
Hi, Ben. I know you're not one for conspiracy theories, but there's a juicy one going around about how the governments around the world are installing 5G towers that cause the coronavirus symptoms and are a form of population control. What would you have to say to that craziness?
That's crazy. I don't know what there is to say about that other than that is absolutely bat bleep loony. I've seen no evidence whatsoever that 5G towers are causing coronavirus symptoms. And even if they did cause coronavirus symptoms, I'm not sure how they would cause coronavirus deaths. And if somebody had a weapon that powerful, don't you think that they probably would have used it on people before? I mean, that sounds like an amazing weapon, honestly. Like we should deploy that in anti-terror zones, apparently, if all we have to do is install a 5G tower and we can knock out like all Baghdadi's friends that way. That sounds pretty awesome, but that's pretty wild, that right there. Thanks for the theory.
All right, Ben, thanks.
I appreciate it. Ezra in New York City, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Ezra.
Hey, Ben, thanks for taking my call. So I was wondering, do you think there's a way to solve the national debt? And if so, how would you go about doing so?
Unfortunately, the only way to actually solve the national debt is to take on the institutional structures that so many people have decided are crucial to America. And that means actually looking at privatizing Social Security for younger people, allowing them to invest their own savings rather than confiscating it from them in a giant pyramid scheme. It means that you would have to restructure Medicaid and Medicare. All of these programs constitute about 66% of the federal budget every year, and they are mandatory spending, meaning that even when there's a government shutdown, those things not only keep spending, but also they are automatic. It's not as though the budget fights that we have every year are over the majority of spending. They're over a vast minority of spending. The only way to really do this would be to take a look in a very real way at how Medicare operates. Maybe have health savings accounts that are set up for younger people as opposed to having the government confiscate wealth from them and pay them back in terms of Medicare. It's one of the things about Medicare that's interesting is, of course, a lot of seniors have been taking advantage of Medicare Advantage, which is a supplemental insurance that they can buy and is more free market based. The same thing is true of Medicaid. There are studies that demonstrate that Medicaid is actually not particularly effective, even for poor people, that having no insurance is not necessarily worse than having Medicaid in many cases because so many doctors don't actually accept Medicaid. All of these programs need to be, examined, scrutinized, and then restructured to avoid the vast amounts of debt we are taking on in those programs. That really is everyone who is serious about the national debt understands these programs have to be restructured.
All right, thanks.
Really appreciate it, Ezra. And yeah, you have a great Passover as well. Dan in New Jersey, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Dan.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for taking my call.
Go for it, sir. Yep.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks very much. I have Crazy Train now stuck firmly in my head. Appreciate that. My question for you is, there's a lot of crazy criticism going around about the Trump administration from mainstream media, et cetera. My question is the whole lack of a testing regimen, would that be something that we could be fairly criticizing of the Trump administration? And if so, what could they do in a reasonable way to actually really ramp up the regimen?
So they are doing their best to ramp up the regimen right now. Yeah, I mean, Dan, here's sort of my view of the Trump administration response. Bad up until mid-March, good after. Right? That's sort of my take. And I think that's true for a lot of state governments as well. Like Andrew Cuomo's being given all sorts of credit, but the state shutdown order in New York didn't happen until mid to late March. The same thing happened in L.A. Mayor Eric Garcetti, as I've mentioned, allowed the L.A. Marathon to go on full bore on March 7th, March 8th, I believe. So, the sort of revisionist history where everybody was right on top of this thing in February, it's just not true. Now, with that said, could Trump have done a lot better in February? Yeah, he could have taken a leadership role. He could have said, instead of downplaying the thing and sort of giving us the information we were all operating off of, he could have said, listen, here are the risks. And by late February, he could have been saying we need a lot more significant ramping up of resources. Now, I think that the Democrats might have bashed him for that. I mean, the fact is that the Democrats passed with him an $8.5 billion spending package on March 6th, I believe. They weren't calling for trillions of dollars in spending at the time or nationwide shutdowns at that point. So the sort of consensus, the public opinion consensus, did not form late January. The notion that it formed late January, the consensus that we needed to shut down all of society and forcibly put a stop to the economy and then spread millions of tests across the country, no one was talking in those terms in late January. I mean, I pointed this out on the show a few days ago, that the simply saying coronavirus could be a problem does not absolve you of the fact that you did not call for serious measures to be taken in late January or indeed anywhere during February. And simply yelling at Trump about it was not an actual solution. So I think a few things can be true. Trump downplayed it. Trump kept pretending that it wasn't a big deal and was not going to be a big deal. And he was not forthcoming with tons of information about what exactly was happening. He allowed the CDC to operate under its own auspices, and that was a mistake. The CDC blew the testing regimen. The FDA blew it as far as allowing new trials and all of the rest of this stuff. But once he got serious, he got serious. And the media have been fundamentally unserious by focusing back on stuff that Trump was saying on February 25th or February 28th, as opposed to the stuff that he's been saying ever since. And even when they're focusing on the stuff that he is doing right now, it's all stuff like, well, he says that he's going to get ventilators and there aren't enough ventilators. And then you ask all the governors, so have you had like an actual hard ventilator shortage right now? They're like, well, no, not really. And then he'll say hydroxychloroquine looks like could be a good thing. And the media will say, no, how dare he? How could he say that? And then Cuomo says the exact same thing. So again, do I think that Trump is overbroad in his language? Yes. Do I think that he says things that are not true about things that he has said before? Absolutely. Is any of that new? No. What is new is that Trump and the administration have got pretty damn serious about this. And the media keep proclaiming that he's ignoring the scientists. And every single day he's got Fauci and Birx out there speaking directly to the American public about this stuff. So I'm not seeing the evidence that the Trump administration is radically botching it right now. I think that there was some botchery at the beginning. But again, I think that botchery in terms of action was bipartisan. In terms of rhetoric was worse for Trump than it was for the Democrats. But, and by the way, worse than it was for Tom Cotton, who was on top of this thing very early.
Right.
But with all of that
his
said,
actions are speaking louder than his words.
Well, yes, and I think that's generally been true throughout his presidency. Now, I do think that, he could do more to unify, but that's been true throughout his presidency as well. I mean, now would be a great time for him to, cut down on sort of the attacks on the media and he's sort of playing into their hands when he plays that game. He really should be just letting the people who are better at this speak. I mean, like Pence, Fauci, Birx, like those would be the people I would have at the microphone right now because they can answer more questions than Trump can. And I would put together, as Dana Perino suggested, I think quite rightly, an economic advisory team and have those people answering questions, right? Explaining what is the plan to get out of this and what is the economic blowback going to be like. I think all of that would be useful. Trump is not his own best advocate. And one of the great failures for President Trump is he believes he is his own best advocate because he's such a counterpuncher. Well, the problem is in a time like this, what you need to be putting forward is a calming face. And I do not think that President's face has ever been described quite as calming, Dan.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Ben. I really appreciate the breakdown.
Well, thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. Victoria in Wisconsin, go for it. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show.
Hi, Ben. Thank you. It's a great honor to be able to talk to you. There's been a lot of fear lately. I've been hearing, especially among conservatives and people of religious groups, particularly Christians right now, and Jews, that some of the laws and policies that are being put in place for the coronavirus are starting to reflect that of like the early Nuremberg laws that persecuted Jews and led to the eventual extermination of them, where people are starting to fear that there might be a police state put in place, that people are going to have their freedom stripped away. And I wanted to know, since you are a Jewish man, what your viewpoint is on that and what you think about people who are starting to get feared that there's going to be rights stripped away that they may not get back without breaking into a civil war.
So, number one, I always hesitate to make any sort of Nazi comparison on the basis of broad policy that equally applies across the board and isn't specifically targeting specific religions. I mean, these sort of orders that have said no mass gatherings and then include churches and synagogues, I don't think they're specifically directed at churches and synagogues. You've got drones on the streets of New York telling people to socially distance. So I think that the draconian measures that are being taken are not religious in nature. And I think that is a comfort. I'm going to start worrying a lot more about rights being stripped if we are still doing this on the basis of uncertain data in a month, right? If this continues to be a permanent feature of American life past the point where the data can't support it and past the point where there can even be an argument that the plans should have been formulated already, then I'm going to start to get quite worried. And admittedly, I think that point would come a lot sooner if I thought that the administration was deeply invested in maintaining huge control of the American public. Like, I don't think Trump actually wants to do that. One of the problems for Democrats is they keep expressing thoughts like, wouldn't it be great if we just, took over huge swaths of the American economy? That could be the new normal. And that's where I start saying, okay, are you guys actually doing this because there's a pandemic, or are you doing this for the purposes of exacerbating all of your priors? Are you really trying to just do all the things you wanted to do and use this as a cover? That's when I would start to get suspicious. And that's true across the board. Do I think the Trump administration is desperate to prevent church gatherings? No, I think precisely the opposite, which is one of the reasons why I think it's very good that Trump keeps saying over and over, we want to reopen this thing. We want you to go back to church. We want all this to happen, but we have to wait until the data show it. Now, that is a reassuring thing to me. If we get to the point 3, 4, 5 months out where the death rate on this thing is minuscule, and we have basically come up with some sort of testing strategy, and the people who are most vulnerable and oldest are still self-quarantining until there's a vaccine available, and still they're telling us you can't go to church, you can't go to synagogue, then I will start to get worried. But up until that point, this is temporary. I do believe that it's temporary. And again, I tend to be more suspicious than most of government power, but I also understand that when a pandemic is happening, and data is imperfect and the fog of war matters, but over time, that fog of war has to clear, or the fog of war becomes an excuse for the growth of government generally.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and many blessings to you and your family over Passover.
All righty, taking more of your phone calls. Paxton in Iowa, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Paxton.
Hey, Ben. How's it going today?
Hey, hanging in there. How are you doing, sir?
I'm kind of being good. I guess I'm kind of being a devil's advocate here. I really believe in about everything you say. But so you were talking about how we need to open up the economy as soon as possible. With doing that, if there's like the second wave, like they say, and it's a whole lot worse than what it is now, how can we justify that on humanity? I mean, I know you have like more of a pro-choice idea or a pro-life idea of life, every life matters. But by pushing to open up the economy too early, wouldn't that be more of a pro-choice view?
Well, nobody is looking to open up the economy too early. The question that has not been answered to my satisfaction or nearly anybody else's is what are we doing right now that prevents the second wave? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. And I've asked a bunch of doctors, what are we doing right now that prevents the second wave? So let's assume that all we can do to prevent the second wave is to work with the treatments that we've got, plus increase ICU beds and ventilators. Okay, great. So let's increase the ICU beds and ventilators so our health system doesn't get overwhelmed. Okay, what then? Like, seriously, what then? Like, what's going to prevent the second wave? So either it's preventable, the second wave, or it's not. If it is not preventable, then I fail to see why keeping the economy closed for another 6 months is going to help us. And if it is preventable, then please spell out the steps whereby that second wave is preventable, and then we can game out what exactly that looks like. And so far, the only people who've been talking about that are people like the fellow from the fellow from the FDA. And Scott Gottlieb, and he's been talking about, mass testing and then contact tracing. Well, I want a timeline as to when that's actually going to be ready and how that is going to be available, because if you want to develop the contact tracing, then you're going to have to radically ramp that up, and I haven't seen that happening. So the question becomes, which strategy is better? The Sweden strategy of, okay, we're going to lock up all the people or tell them to lock themselves up, all the people who are vulnerable and all the people who are older, and then we're going to let everybody else go out. And yeah, there's going to be more of a death spike at the beginning, but that is going to wane quickly, and then there is no second wave. Or our strategy, which is suppress it so it doesn't overwhelm the healthcare system, which, again, understandable. And then the second wave is nearly as big. And so the number of people who end up dying is very similar to Sweden's, except that we ruined our economy and they didn't. Right? That is the big question here. So really appreciate the call. Nobody is interested in people dying here. We're looking for choices where fewer people die and the economy remains open and functional over time. Paxton, really appreciate the call. We'll take more of your calls at 855-236-3228. Coming up, this is The Ben Shapiro Show.